Hi, welcome to Pavitra. Hi Pooja, thank you for joining us. How are you this evening? Sunny, thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to our session. Priya, thank you for following us and joining us today. I hope I'm clear. If you could just give me a thumbs up, if you could hear me, that'd be great. I'm well, Pooja. Excited to speak with our guest today. I think it would be an interesting session. If you could just let me know that you could hear me with a thumbs up, excellent. Thank you so much, Pooja. Appreciate it. Thank you, Priya. Appreciate that. So we are discussing the science of spirituality today, and thank you, Jaisal. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for following us. Hare Krishna to everyone. Neha, thank you. Ashwin, good to see you. Joining in. We shall get started in a couple of minutes. Jyoti, thank you for joining us today. Ashwin, good evening. How are you doing today?
Hi Chetan, I'm not too sure as to whether I should be when we are on Insta Live. Should I be calling you Chetan or should I call you Chetan G or should I call you CA? I'm not too sure what I should call you.
Whatever works for you. Chetan is good, CA is good, Chetan G is not acceptable.
Good to see you, my dear.
Very
Good to
good to
see
see you,
you.
Ashwin. Very good. So we're just going to wait for a couple of minutes while we have a few more people joining in. I'm sure there are a lot of people excited to hear you speak, Ashwin.
Sure.
And then we'll get right into it.
Okay, cool.
Sushma, thank you for joining us. We will start our session in a couple of minutes. Neeta ji, thank you. Uh, Welcome to this session this evening, which I'm sure is going to be quite interesting because when Ashwin speaks, everybody does listen. Ridesh, thank you for coming on our platform today. Appreciate it. Yes, it is amazing to see Ashwin and Pavitra connect, and I will tell you how that happened as we go on in our talks today. Varun, thank you. Mr. Vardhan, thank you. And so, Ashwin, I'm going to get going. We have people joining in. Welcome to
Sure.
Pavitra, an ecosystem for the soul. At Pavitra, we aim to enhance the health, wellness, and spiritual quotient of all living beings. Please follow us on our social media handles on YouTube at Pavitra Connect, as well as Instagram and Facebook at Pavitra Connect for all the latest updates on our upcoming product, service launches, as well as our workshops and sessions such as these. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And my guest this evening is a very dear friend who I don't get to see very often, but he is arguably India's leading author. He has the Bharat series, which includes the Chanakya's Chant, Rosabal line, Keepers of the Kala Chakra, and more recently, a bestseller called The Vault of Vishnu. He also has two bestseller, New York Times bestsellers with James Patterson. And he also has a very interesting book series called the 13 Step series, which includes marks, health, parenting. And I can tell you, I read one of them, which is called the 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck, after which I got a date from Ashwin to come on this platform. So these books work, and I think you should go and buy a few of them. So Ashwin, you're also in the Forbes Celebrity Top 100 list, and you have so many other accolades and awards. But I really am grateful for you to coming on this platform and joining us today. So welcome.
I'm delighted to be here, Chetan, and the audience here may not be aware of the very, very close friendship and connection that you and I enjoy.
Yes.
So that makes it even more special for me to be here, unlike any ordinary interaction.
That,
So
that's
thank you
that.
for inviting me, and I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you
Thank you,
so
Ashwin. That's very kind of you. So, Ashwin, I want to get started, and I know we are here to talk about the science of spirituality. But on a personal note, I mean, I wanted to understand. You went from this South Bombay Cathedral, Yale educated, from a very reputed, Marwari industrialist family to being an author. I mean, that's not par for the course. How did that
That's
happen?
right. Well, I was never expected to be a writer. In fact, the honest to God truth is that in a typical, I mean, my mother is a Banya, my father is a Marwadi, so it's a
Right.
deadly combination in that sense.
Absolutely.
And the only two words that are relevant in that Marwadi vocabulary are debit and credit. So those are the
True.
two words that I grew up with. But I think the parallel influence on my life was my Nanaji. He
Okay.
wasn't my real grandfather, but my grand uncle, as it were,
Right.
maternal grand uncle. And he used to send me a book every week to read. And in fact, I'm sitting currently in my study come library,
Yep.
and there are about a couple of hundred books on that top shelf, which actually was sent by Nanaji during his lifetime.
Wow.
And he expected me to write a letter to him every week, telling him what I had read and what I liked and disliked. It was the earliest form of a book review, as it were.
True.
And of course, my father was equally interested that I get into work early.
Sure.
So I started working alongside my father probably from age 13, 14 onwards.
Wow.
And whenever I would go into the office, I would carry one of Nanaji's books with me, because then at lunchtime or whenever I had a little
Sure.
time to spare, I could read.
Right.
And there was a Munimji in our office, and he used to always tell me that bookkeeping was more important than book reading.
Right.
And so I would go back to Nanaji and I would say, listen, here you are sending me these books, and here there is Munimji who says
Right.
that, listen, don't worry about all of this. So Nanaji had this wonderful way of being able to simplify things. He would say that, beta, remember one thing, that Lakshmi without Saraswati is of no use.
Right.
And he would say that the relationship between these two Devijis is very, very unique, because Lakshmi is innately curious about where Saraswati is.
True.
If Saraswati happens to be in this room, then Lakshmi also wants to be in this room. And if Saraswati gets up and leaves, then Lakshmi is curious, where has Saraswati gone? So she also gets up and leaves. So he said, even if your aim, even if your objective is that of Munimji, that is
Right.
to run after Lakshmi, the best way of doing that is going after Saraswati.
Amazingly
And he
said.
said, in Hinduism, in the Hindu pantheon of gods, as it were, of course, we have 33 million of them, but
Wow.
amongst the pantheon of the major gods and goddesses, the only person who can actually sit between Lakshmi and Saraswati is actually Ganesh, because Ganesh is the connector of wealth and wisdom, which
Right.
probably to a certain extent, Chetan, explains why Ashwin Sanghi has the figure that he does.
That's very amazingly such a complicated concept, but you put it so simply, and it's interesting. And going forward, Ashwin, we also want to draw inspiration from you, because I know in one of your talks at the Mind Rush, I think it was Business Insider Mind Rush, you mentioned about the tribulations that you had to publish your first book. And I think for the young people on this platform, and as well as from all of
Sure.
us,
Sure.
you got through that, and tell us about that. Give us a little story on that one.
So you mentioned a book which I wrote within the 13 Steps series, which is called 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck. Actually,
Yes.
that book deals a lot with my own personal story in some ways, because when I started writing my very first book, the very first book was a book called The Rosabal Line.
Yeah.
And that was a book actually that came into existence primarily because of someone who brought you and me together, that is my wife, Anushika.
Yes.
And so, I mean, for the audience that is watching, the original friendship between Chetan and me is actually not the original friendship.
Yes.
It's actually a friendship between my wife, Anu, and Chetan.
True.
And I became friends much later with him. But I had been to on a trip in Srinagar, and I ended up coming across this particular tomb,
Right.
which is known as Rosabal. It translates to Tomb of the Prophet. It's a fantastic place because of the fact that the original historical records date back to 124 AD, which is
Wow.
2000 years ago.
Wow.
And beneath the burial, the person buried there is someone called Yus Asaf. But of course, there is a political element to this particular location, because it's
Sure.
believed to be the final resting place of someone called Nasiruddin, who is a Muslim Peer from the 13th century. But what is incredible is that there is an earlier burial under that of Nasiruddin, And unlike the Nasiruddin burial, which points with the head towards Mecca, this is an east-west burial, which indicates that it's a Jewish burial of ancient times. And outside the tomb, of course, there is a carving which shows a pair of human feet with little marks indicating where the nails for a crucifixion would have been hammered in.
Wow.
So, my dear friend Amish Tripathi and I very often have these discussions, and we discuss that do we go out looking for stories? But his view has always been, and I'm in agreement with that view, that actually stories come looking for us. So this was a story that came looking for me, and I was just completely enchanted by this story. I spent the next year and a half researching it. I ended up reading more than about 45 books on various topics related to this particular story. And at the end of that, Anu told me, she said, listen, you're becoming a pain to live with because of the fact that the only thing that we discuss is this particular tomb. So she said, you need to get it out of your system. So why don't you write something? And that's what resulted in the Rosabal line. But unfortunately, writing a book is far easier than getting it published. At least that was the case in 2007, 2000. Actually, between 2005 and 2007, I was looking for a publisher and I couldn't find. Eventually, I was rejected by a host of literary agents and publishers, about 47 to be precise. And there was a dear family friend of ours, a Punjabi gentleman, who was fond of his Johnny Walker Black Label, used to come home and spend Friday evenings or Saturday evenings downing Patiala pegs with my father. And he said to me one day, he said, "Beta, kya ho gaya hai? Tum bade depressed lag rahe ho." So I said, "Uncle ji, main kya karun? 45, 47 odd people have said thank you, but no thank you." He said, "Kya usme problem hai? Ek do aur ko apply kar do." So I said, "Nahi, but mere list pe aur koi baki hai hi nahi. There's no one left to apply to." So he said, remember one thing, beta, in life, 99% is about good luck. So I was in an argumentative mood, Chetan. So I asked, I said, what about the 1%? That 1% must be hard work, talent, efficiency, networking, resources. There are so many things that go into making someone successful.
True.
And he picked up his glass, he drained the remaining part of the whiskey, slammed the glass on the coffee table in front, and he said, 99% is good luck and 1% is known as bloody good luck. So he said, just wait for your bloody good luck to kick in. He said, because you cannot time your bloody good luck. And that's through your platform. What I want to say to the youngsters who are listening here is probably that, listen, wait for your bloody good luck to kick in. It kicks in for everyone eventually, but you can't time it. It could happen to you when you're 20 years old. It could happen when you are 50. It could happen when you are 80. But it's there for everyone. And that's very important. A lot of people think that success is about some great things that people do. Frankly, success is simply about getting up when you fall down.
Nice. And Ashwin, that's amazing to hear. I wanted to also touch upon something that you mentioned here about waiting for your time, and probably towards the latter half of this session, I'll talk about some of the stuff that you spoke about in one of your other chats about dhairya and some of the Rishi Muni that you mentioned. Now, something on a lighter note, I know that I've heard of Nostradamus, but then I heard of Ashwin Sanghi, and I'll tell you why. I would like to look at, this is the Vault of Vishnu, and I'm lucky to have an autographed copy of this by Ashwin. And I'll just read a couple of lines from page 1, and I'll tell you what I'm trying to say. It said that the entire expanse of 34 plus miles between highest and lowest points was boulderstone, hence the name Doklam. And the Chinese called it by a different name. Then you go on to say that the first encounter with the Chinese was peaceful, after which you say that the dragon was on the move. And this book came out before the Doklam incident. I mean, kya soch rahe the aap? Or on another lighter note, I'm sure the Indian Defense Establishment is now waiting for your next book. कि अभी Ashwin क्या बोलेगा, तो हम वही करेंगे जो उसकी अगली book में लिखा होगा.
There have been many instances where stuff which has been talked about by me in my books has unfortunately ended up playing out in real life in some ways. And I'm not happy about that, because I really don't want to be any sort of predictor of bad news, as it were.
Sure.
When the Rosabal line was written between 2005 and 2006, and then it was published eventually, self-published in 2007, it talked about a boat off the coast of Mumbai honing in for a terrorist attack, and then 26/11 happened in 2008. And then, of course, currently we've had the Chinese incursions on our borders.
Yes.
And even though this book refers to the previous encounter, which is Doklam, but
Yeah.
I am talking a lot about the fact that there are superhuman forces on the Chinese
Yes.
side. And we now know that, of course, there has been a lot of work within Chinese laboratories related to the element of bioengineering.
Yes.
I have talked about the fact that the Chinese forces are trained in martial arts. And again, this is very interesting because barely a few weeks ago, we saw news items related to martial arts experts being deployed by the Chinese forces along the Indo-China border. So there are many, many things which are playing out. The way I see it is that there is a very, very close connect between fact and fiction. I know that the old proverb goes that fact is stranger than fiction. In that sense, the sort of books that I write, I tend to take a lot of inspiration from what has already happened before.
Right.
As a result of which, with the stuff that I write, the chances or the likelihood of it happening again are very, very high because history repeats itself. There are patterns in history. So in that sense, I don't consider myself to be someone who is a very good predictor of what is going to happen. Probably it's just that my fiction is inspired by what has already happened.
Got it. Fair enough. Ashwin, the topic today is the science of spirituality. And you are obviously one of the most well-read authors. You've done amazing amounts of research on the Ardha Shastra and the Shanti Parva, I think, Purva, and many other, the Gita, and you've read it all. What's your view, and elaborate on the connect between the science, spirituality, and the science of spirituality, so to speak?
Well, I mean, if, for those who, to a certain extent, I genuinely believe that the best scientists of our world were actually in some ways philosophers. And the best philosophers of our world are also scientists, because we are increasingly realizing that the connect between the two is so immense. You think about this, that I read this wonderful book, Chetan, and for those who want to explore this subject a little deeper, it's a book called The Tao of Physics, and it's written by someone called Fritjof Capra. It's not a new book. It's something which was written probably in the 1960s or probably 1960s. But it's a book which talks about the fact that if you really think about it, the stuff that quantum theory is now attempting to dig into, which is in terms of the nature of matter, the nature of energy, the transformation of energy into matter, the fact that everything in the world seems to be having an interconnection, the fact that even a thought seems to have some sort of a physical manifestation of some nature. A lot of the deeper questions of quantum theory are the very questions that our Rishi Munis were exploring through the Rig Veda and through the Upanishads. So in that sense, who was it who, it was, I think, Victor Hugo, who said that, where does the telescope end and where does the microscope begin? Or where does the microscope end and where does the telescope begin? So the difference was really in terms of only the approach that is being taken. With the rishis, they were concerned about exploring deeper within, and they saw within as simply a manifestation of the without. They were concerned with primarily looking at intuitively trying to discover the truth. Whereas scientists are trying to discover it objectively or rationally, as it were. So in that sense, the methodology is different, but ultimately what they are attempting to discover is pretty much the same. And that's why, to that extent, I believe that over a period of time, spirituality is going to come closer to science, and science is going to come
Going to come
closer to
closer to
spirituality.
spirituality. Amazing. Ashwin, you also, in your books, I'll ask you two questions on this. You also have a lot of, reference to Shakti in your writings. And also, personally, do you believe that there is a higher power that exists? And what's your, take on that?
Uh, well, just before I come to the Shakti element, the
Yes.
one more thing that strikes me is there is a very interesting passage in the Rig Veda, which says, "O son, I bow to you, the one who travels 2,202 yojanas in half a nimisha." And when you actually translate that using the Arthashastra units,
Right.
the units of measurement from the Arthashastra, you actually come very close to the modern day speed of light,
Wow.
which is about roughly 186,000 miles per second.
That's
So the
fascinating.
point I'm trying to make is that now, when I think about this, Chetan, I wonder that how were rishis who were sitting in the middle of forests and
Yeah,
looking at natural phenomena, they didn't probably have telescopes or they didn't have
absolutely.
any modern equipment to be able to monitor all of this, but they were
Yes.
still able to look at a lot of this stuff and were able to intuitively figure it out.
Yeah.
That is where I believe that the that over a period of time, and you look at some of the greatest, look at some of the greatest, what should I say, thinkers, even in the world of even in the world of science. Whether it was Heisenberg, whether it was Bohr, whether it was Einstein, they were all reading material like the Rig Veda as well as the
Oh,
Upanishads,
really?
and were
Wow.
deeply influenced by the Vedic texts. So, and probably they had no alternative because there was no equivalent
Of
that
that
could
body of
probably
knowledge.
give them, which could probably give them an equivalent insight.
Amazing.
So
Wow.
I think, I mean, take for example something as simple as the wave particle theory. I mean, we know that light
Yes.
behaves as both a wave as well as a particle. I mean, that's the starting point of quantum theory, as it were. And there is something which is very basic in quantum theory, which is so-called double slit
Hmm.
experiment, where
Okay.
you have a screen with a single slit in it, and you then pass a beam of light through it, and then of course you capture the reflection at the other end with another
Hmm.
screen.
Right.
Now, logically speaking, when you have that single slit, the light moves through, and it comes across on the receiving screen as a single slit also, which is
Right.
common sense.
Right.
But now, instead, when you replace this single slit with a double slit, you don't end up getting two slits
Two
at the
slides.
receiving end, but you get an interference pattern, which means that you have confused the hell out of the light wave
Right.
because it doesn't know what to do.
Which, yeah.
Now, what has actually changed is actually observation. Uh, so light can behave both as a wave or as a particle. And what has actually changed between the two is the observer. In other words, in some ways, the observer influences the observed. And this was something which was very deeply ingrained within our philosophies. We talked a lot about these sort of things, that, how do I separate my mind from my consciousness?
Yes.
How do I separate myself, my body from my mind,
Come on. Yeah.
and so on and so forth? Increasingly, as we are going along, we are realizing that even right now, I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
Of course, we have now modern technology by which we can see each other, and there are 40, 50 others who can see us, or
Sure.
a couple of hundred people or 1,000
Sure.
people who can see us. But the point is that to a very great extent, we are now realizing about even concepts like, for example, telepathy or
Right.
telekinesis, that there is a scientific basis to it. We are now suddenly realizing that even plants can have feelings, and that I mean, simply talking to your plants can make sure that they grow better. So a lot
Yeah.
of the things that we thought of as gobbledygook we thought of it
Yes.
as completely crazy and out there, is no longer crazy and is no longer out there. That's, I think, a very important point.
So even when you talk about plants behaving differently, there was even a study by a Japanese scientist where he looked at water and exposed them to different kinds of music, and the atoms reacted differently when the
Absolutely.
music was calmer and they were sort of much nicer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So going back to your, sorry, I slightly
No, that's
sidetracked you, Chetan. The question that you left me off with was the question on Shakti. And for me, honestly, I must tell you, in my life, there have been several people. Uh, I believe that female energy has actually played a very, very critical role in my life, whether it is my mother, whether it's my sister, my wife, my Rakhi sister, I mean, the only form of female energy that I have not had the blessing of is probably a daughter, because I have a son. But
right.
but to a very great extent, some of the most major decisions and the most major influences in my life
Right.
have actually come from Shakti. So when I think about this, I realize that we have a tendency to look at uh, uh, male versus female,
Hmm.
and we think of them as dualities. We think of them as opposites. But
Right.
I've never really thought of it as opposites. For me, for example, when we look at concepts like, let's say, heat and cold, I don't see them as opposites. I see
Hmm.
coldness as simply the absence of heat. Or, for example, light and dark, I don't see it as opposites. I see darkness as simply the absence of light. Or foolish and wise. No, foolishness is not the opposite of wisdom. Foolishness is simply the absence of
Absence.
wisdom. And in that sense, we tend to think of male and female as opposites, but the way I see male energy is actually the absence of
Of
female energy.
female.
So in that sense, I don't see Shakti and Shiva as opposites. I see Shiva as simply the absence of Shakti. And I know that there are probably many Shiv bhakts out there who would maybe have an issue with that.
Right.
But I genuinely believe that some of us are more endowed with Shakti, and we should stop thinking of Shakti as simply a female energy form. Shakti is
Okay.
nothing else but energy. So you either have more of Shakti or you have less of Shakti. And that's the
Right.
reason why in all of my books, you will normally see a very, very strong emphasis on the Shakti element,
Mm.
because I genuinely believe that.
Awesome. A lot of good comments coming in. Everybody says they love your books, Ashwin, which I'm sure you know because they're selling like hotcakes all the time. On another, the pandemic that's upon us, people are locked in and people have there's a fear psychosis. Spirituality, they say, sort of aligns your mind and you can go inwards with, when you connect. Uh, it can make our minds go down the right path and maybe think more clearly or more, make your body healthier if you're thinking right. What's your view on that? I mean, talk to us about, spirituality and the connect in terms of your thoughts changing your destiny, your thoughts changing your health. Is that something you believe in?
Uh, to a very great extent, Chetan, for me personally, I have always found that, the very first time that I had a transformational experience was when I went for the first time of a Vipassana program in Igatpuri.
Okay.
And I came out of there. Of course, the first 2 or 3 days, I was like a complete madman. I was almost bouncing off the walls of my room, as it were. And then eventually I realized that I was able to actually calm my mind. Now, the ancient rishis, in some ways, already knew the intimate connect between your mind and body, as it were. They
Right.
realized that actually, to a very great extent, you could, there was an intimate connection between your mind and your breath.
Right.
And they realized that actually, when you are agitated, you breathe faster.
True.
Your breaths
Yeah.
become shorter and you breathe faster. Now,
Yes.
that is a very, very ordinary observation in terms of the correlation between breath and mind.
Right.
But they flipped it around, and they said that, well, if my mind is agitated and I breathe faster, then can I make my mind less agitated by breathing slower
Being slow.
and breathing more calmly and breathing deeper? And so they actually sort of, in some ways, took that correlation, and it's not that obvious a correlation. I mean, in that sense, because that reverse causality is not something that would intuitively come to your mind.
True.
But they figured that, hey, listen, let's try and see as to whether there is a way that we can breathe deeper and we can be more conscious of our breathing, and whether
Right.
it can help in terms of reducing the agitation on our minds. And that is where yogic breathing, the concept of pranayam comes in from. So in that sense, I believe that there is a deeper connect. For me, at least, some of my best writing.
We seem to have lost Ashwin. Ashwin, we lost you for
No,
a second.
I'm
You're
back.
back on.
I'm
Yeah.
back. I'm back.
So you were saying your best writing. Some of your
My
best writing, Kim.
Yeah. So my best writing has happened at times when I am, when I look back at that writing a couple of days later,
Right.
and I think to myself, I say, hey, listen, Ashwin, is this your writing?
Is this you? Yeah.
Is this you? Because forget about the words, but even the ideas that you've expressed, are you capable of even expressing those ideas? Where did those ideas come from? So in that sense, I believe that, that it's very interesting, Chetan, but the word yoga, etymologically, it is related to the Indo-European root of that is actually yoke.
Really? Okay.
Now, so whether you look at the English word yoke, which is to latch on to something, to yoke a cart to the bull or to the bullock.
Right.
That word yoke and the word yog have a common ancestor. They have a common root.
Okay.
And if you really think about it, what yoga was talking about was simply in terms of attaching yourself to the divine.
Right.
Yoking yourself to a greater power.
Okay.
Becoming one with the universe. And quantum theory is also now telling us that, hey, listen, when you think of I, me, myself, listen, it's foolish. You're living in a universe of interconnected energies, and anything and everything seems to be a mass of energy transformations going on. So in that sense, you are not independent and separated. So the only difference is that you think you are because of your consciousness and your mind and your ego. But otherwise you aren't. You are part of this interconnected maze of energies, as it were. So in that sense, when even Einstein was talking about E equal to mc squared, what he was basically saying is that energy is transformed into matter and matter is transformed into energy, and everything and anything is connected. When I'm sitting across the table from you, I'm looking at you and I think of you as particulate matter. I think of you as mass, but actually you're nothing else but a wave function. And I do not know for sure that when I turn away, will that wave function still be in existence or not? So I think we are beginning to understand what is meant by spooky action at a distance. We are beginning to, for example, the whole very nature of the idea that you can have quantum theory at a distance, where you can have quantum entanglement. I'm assuming that that the basics of quantum entanglement are known to some of the audience out here. But quantum entanglement basically implies that you could have a subatomic particle sitting in New Delhi and another one in New York. But when you measure them, they actually exhibit similar characteristics. So their spin, the direction of their spin, the velocity of their spin is identical, even though there is nothing connecting them. There is absolutely nothing connecting them. So I think that, to my mind, is what being more calm, being more composed, it allows you to tune in to those frequencies that your consciousness in some ways prevents you from tuning into.
Amazing, amazing. That's when you say it like that, one can really understand and one can imagine what the ancient wisdoms of the our Rishi Munis and they were already probably there. They already understood this at a level that we are
Absolutely.
just beginning to understand.
Absolutely. And I make no bones about it that I understand all of this at a theoretical level. So I understand it at a rational level. I am
Right.
yet to understand it at an intuitive level. So, it was, I think it was Einstein or Newton, I can't remember who said that, uh, we, we have made rational knowledge into the master, whereas actually intuitive knowledge should
Yes,
be the master. So I think that is where we all need to go. The mere fact that we are having this discussion today is
right.
probably one step in that direction.
Absolutely. Amazing. As always, Ashwin, I mean, when you speak, it's so engaging and one can really take one's own mind towards understanding where we are largely more connected in life. Ashwin, you also read a lot, and I like to read, not obviously as much as you. Uh, I want a tip from you that, you've read thousands of books and people like to absorb certain, parts of the book. But when you're reading so much and you get kind of, what is there a, method to your, how can we, read better? How can we sort of figure out a way to, okay, from this book, I want to keep this as a takeaway. What do you do for that? I mean, how do you keep all of this in your?
Uh, well, one of course is you're right. I do read a lot, but I generally find that for me, maintaining a journal is very, very important to what I do. So generally with every book, there will be a couple of takeaways which are very, very important. And those are the takeaways that I want to hang on to.
Right.
And this is an old habit that I actually got from my Nanaji.
Okay.
During my school days, I would always have a problem in terms of memorizing stuff.
Right.
So he had this habit of, for every subject, he made me actually create an 80-page small, one of those thin 80-page
Yeah.
notebooks.
Yes.
And he would say that, when you come back from school at the end of the day, take out half a page and put down the most important things that were said in class.
Okay.
And you don't need to then after that do any revision, because that will
Just go
become the
back to that.
basis of everything, because that will be retained.
True.
And in a book called 13 Steps to Bloody Good Marks, I talk about the learning curve,
Right.
which means that in case you revisit anything within a period of 24 hours after having originally learnt it, the chances are that more than 70% of it will have been retained by your brain.
Right.
So I think those are little tricks that I built along the way in terms of how to preserve that information.
Got
So
it.
for me, my journal is in the form of a Gmail account that is not shared with anyone. It is only for me. So I email myself. And that could be something that you have asked me in this conversation. And I may say, oh, how did Chetan come about asking me this question? So I email that question to myself. Or if I'm reading a book and I come across a paragraph that is very interesting, I will transcribe that paragraph and I'll email it to myself. I may come across a video of an interaction and I may send myself that YouTube link or that particular Instagram post. Very often if I'm traveling and I've seen a particular shadow and I found that it had a mythological element to it, I'll take a picture of that and I'll email myself. So those are all the various ideas, because, we as fiction writers, ultimately at the end of the day, what are we? We are spinners of yarns. So, we find ways to creatively lie. But the problem is that when you sit down to write a book, 90% of the time you don't get ideas. The ideas come when you're not planning to write a book. So the answer is to actually capture those ideas or capture those thoughts. And that applies whether you're reading or whether you're observing or whether you're talking or doing anything else. That I think bringing in that element of being conscious of what you're doing. And I think the greatest spiritual masters now are talking about consciousness. Yes. They're talking about something as simple as enjoying that cup of tea and being completely conscious
in
about
the moment. Yes.
In that moment.
Yeah.
So I think that is the only only suggestion that I can make, that even when you're reading, try and be in the
Be in the
moment.
moment. So are you a Kindle kind of guy, or is it the physical book that works for you?
Uh, Actually, it's both, Chetan,
Okay.
because I end up doing. I mean, of course, now in the last 4 or 5 months of this lockdown, there has been zero travel.
Yes.
But otherwise, on an average, my travel schedule used to be about anywhere between 10 and 15 days a
A
month
month.
for on my lecture circuit and speaking circuit and so on
Right.
and so forth. So most of my reading would happen on flights or in hotel rooms.
Okay.
And it was far easier to do that on a Kindle
True.
than to do that in the physical world.
True.
But at the same time, that the romance of a physical book is something which is very difficult to replicate on a Kindle. So, for example, being able to meet an author and get his physical autograph on a paper copy is not the same, because you can't replicate
Of
that on
course.
a Kindle.
Of course.
Or, for example, flipping through the pages and being able to smell the paper. That's not possible with a Kindle.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, there are advantages of a Kindle, which are like, for example, I mean, if you are having an eyesight problem, then you can alter the font size.
Yeah.
Or, for example, if I'm using a book as a reference, but I can't exactly remember where that reference was, I can do a
You could.
search.
True. True.
So it's stacked up one against the other. So what I normally do is, I first always, if a Kindle version is available, I'll buy the book on the Kindle.
Okay.
Thereafter, in case I've really liked the book, I'll
You'll pick
still
up
go
the
and buy
physical.
a physical copy so that I can add it into my library, and
Right behind
the
you.
romance of the book is still maintained.
Excellent. Ashwin, in your Mind Rush talk at Business Insider, you spoke about a couple of very interesting things about, there was this Muni called, I can't get his name, but it's about about Dharya, Shrishti. You spoke about the old sayings which are valid in today's, the ancient wisdom relevant today. Can you talk about that? I think it was Maharishi Manu, was it?
Yeah, but a lot of the stuff that has been talked about in the Arthashastra is stuff which, I mean, Chanakya himself does not claim to be the author of the Arthashastra.
Right.
So he, is very clear that whether it was Bhrigu and whether it was several other greats who had come before him, he is
Yeah.
simply distilling that wisdom and trying to present it. Now, of course, most of that, Chetan, to a very great extent, is not necessarily available through the Arthashastra, because the Arthashastra per se is something which is a work on the science of wealth. I mean, Artha, wealth,
Okay.
Shastra, science of wealth. And in that sense, Chanakya is not attempting to be philosophical about it. But you can make out all the influences that come on Chanakya. So, for example, I mean, if you think about it, Chanakya talks about friendship, something as simple as friendship, and he says that, hey, listen, there is no friendship without some self-interest. So when you purely talk about an altruistic friendship, it does not exist. Or he talks about what makes for a good alliance. And so, in other words, which king can be considered as your friend and which one is to be considered your enemy.
Your enemy.
And
Right.
the fact that your enemy's enemy is your friend. Or, for example, he talks about the fact that he, I mean, he makes it very difficult for a king to actually operate, because if you really think about it, I mean, we have a 24-hour day,
Yes.
but at the times of Chanakya, you actually had a muhurat, which was 90 minutes, equivalent to so we have a 60-minute hour, whereas they had a 90-minute hour. So,
Okay.
but for every muhurat of the day, he has actually outlined what is required for a king to do: get up, meditate, pray, meet the counselors, take secret reports from the spies, get revenue expenditure reports, and so on and so forth. I mean, he even provides for time for contemplation and personal contemplation and all of that. So he, in other words, in some ways is impacting the way that you should be performing your duties. Uh, and of course, most people like to talk about Chanakya and the concepts of Samdam, Dand, Bhed, and all of that. They talk about Kutniti and they call him the Indian Machiavelli. That is so completely wrong, because I mean, if you talk about Chanakya, I mean, yesterday we had news items talking about taxation policy and trying to make taxation in this country.
Simpler, yeah.
Chanakya talks about that as a fruit ripens on a tree, so it should be plucked. Don't pluck unripe fruits. And he's talking about taxation policy 2,300 years ago.
Wow.
He's talking about something like, for example, nobility of purpose, that in their happiness, in their meaning the kingdom's happiness, in their happiness lies the king's happiness. He shall not do what pleases him, but shall do what pleases them. I mean, so if you read between the lines of Kautilya, the influences of the great seers who were talking about a greater good, about the greater purpose, that was very much there. So in that sense, I would say that even if you simply do a reading of the Arthashastra, some of that is bound to come across in Kautilya's writings.
Okay. Ashwin, I know you are a busy man, and we've got you for probably another 10 minutes. And if the audience would like to ask any question, they can probably post it on the chat group. You also spoke about, on one of your chats, you spoke about that how the ancient wisdom is still applicable today. And you also somewhere mentioned about the Ramayana having a push vahan. And, so tell us about, that connection and where do you feel that, all of that ancient wisdom is somewhere connected to where we are today.
We had two primary bodies of literature, as it were, in our country. One was so-called Itihas, and the other was Puran. Itihas literally translates to as it happened.
Yes.
Or in fact, actually, it's not only about as it happened, but it's also about as it will happen. So in other words, Itihas in that sense is simply a statement of fact in some ways. And on the other hand, Puran was meant to be fantastical literature. In other words, in the words of C.S. Lewis, you were not digging for the literal truth. You were digging for the lie that reveals a truth. In other words, you were looking for what was the hidden meaning of the Puran. What was the allegorical depth of the Puran? What was it trying to convey to you? So you had Itihas and you had Puran. But think about this, Chetan. What did we include in Itihas? What we included in Itihas were the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we like to call them our mythology. But the truth of the matter is that before the British came along, those were our Itihas. Those were our history. And on the other hand, the fantastical elements, the fantasy was in the Purans. Now, the problem that has arisen is that because of the fact that there are elements within our Itihas which are fantastical. Like, for example, you mentioned the Pushpak Viman. But the problem is that because of those fantastical elements, we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we say, no, all of it is fantastical. But by that logic, even if you were to go back into the Purans, which are supposed to be fantasy, there are lineages of kings, actual kings. So there is elements of history within our Puran, and there are elements of fantasy within our history. In other words, there is an overlap between history and mythology. And that is what fascinates me, because I believe that where there is an overlap between myth and history, you end up with that tantalizing zone, which is called mystery. Myth plus history is equal to mystery. Now, the point is that why should we today say that, listen, everything can be written off as simply myth? What is a myth? A myth is a lie that reveals a deeper truth. I was fascinated when I went to Kolkata some years ago, and I went into a temple just by chance, and it turned out to be a temple dedicated to Amitabh Bachchan. And when I walked out of the temple, a little boy came along and sold me a little prayer booklet, which was known as the Amitabh Chalisa. And I thought to myself, I said, think about this, Ashwin. Right now, You are standing here waiting for your car to come and pick you up. Imagine that the car's brake fails and this car knocks you down, and you take birth 1,000 years from now. And 1,000 years from now, the cult of Amitabh worship has really caught on. Now there isn't one temple dedicated to Amitabh Bachchan, but there are 1 lakh temples dedicated to Amitabh. And someone asks you that, do you think that Amitabh could have been a real person in history? Could he have been a real man? But that's precisely the question that we are asking ourselves about Ram and Krishna and so many others. The point I'm making is that would we have written 300 versions of the Ramayana if there wasn't some kernel of truth in that basic story? Today we know that, when I was writing the Krishna key, I realized that there is an element in the Mahabharata which talks about Rishi Vyas going and meeting Dhritarashtra on the eve of the Great War. And he says, please don't fight this war because your entire dynasty will be wiped out. Aapka vansh ka nash ho jayega. And he points out to 3 astronomical elements in the night skies. Now, there is someone called Professor Narhari Achar who has looked into the night skies of Kurukshetra for the last 25,000 years. And he finds that there is only one date, which is 3067 BC, which is the date on which all these 3 signs were visible over Kurukshetra.
Wow.
And that 3067 BC ties up beautifully with the start of Kali Yuga, as far as the Surya Siddhant, which is our ancient astronomical work, is concerned. It ties up beautifully with that. That is roughly about 30-40 years plus or minus Krishna's death. There are so many little things that I could go on and on, where I find that there is that perfect overlap, that there is that tying up. Would we have written 300 versions of the Ramayana? If you look at the versions of the Ramayana, all of them tell you rather different stories. You have, of course, the most famous, which is the Valmiki Ramayana, or the original Ramayana. But in that, Ram is not a god. In that, Ram is an ordinary human being. And then, of course, you have the Tulsi Ramayana, in which Ram has become a Vishnu avatar. But then if you go beyond that, if you take the Adbhut Ramayana, the Anand Ramayana, the Jain Ramayana, the Muslim Ramayana, the Lao Ramayana, there are so many versions. 300 versions.
I didn't know that.
And each of them have slightly different stories. For example, if you go back into the Adbhut Ramayana, there are references to Sita being the daughter of Ravan. If you go back into the Anand Ramayana, then there is the possibility that actually the death of Ravan was brought about by Sita manifesting as Durga. But all of them have a surprising constancy in terms of the basic story. So the mere fact that we spent so many generations narrating that story differently across 300 versions should tell you that probably it was an important enough event for us to do that. The Mahabharata, take the Mahabharata. We started out with a work which was known as the Jaya. And the Jaya eventually gave us a work known as the Bharat. And the Bharat gave us a work known as the Mahabharata. Jaya starts out as about roughly 25,000 verses, morphs into a work which is called the Bharat, which is 50,000 verses, then morphs into something which is bigger, 100,000 verses, the Mahabharata. Probably happened over generations. I don't believe that Rishi Vyas was one individual. Rishi Vyas was generations of writers who ended up penning the Mahabharata. But do you think that generations would have sat down to write up this epic if there wasn't a basic truth to it?
It doesn't make sense. It has to be some finality. Some truth to this whole.
So I think and then I come across people who say, no, but this is not historical. But then what is history? It was the great novelist George Santana who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. So it's one version of events. So in that sense, mythology in that way is truer because it's not attempting to give you a literal interpretation of those events. It's saying that, hey, listen, I've mixed my fact and fiction. Since we spoke about the Arthashastra, let's go back to, for example, Chanakya. We have lots of work written by Chanakya, but we have very little work written about Chanakya. our reference point to Chanakya is actually a Sanskrit play, which is known as the Mudra Rakshas. And the Mudra Rakshas is written almost 700 years after the passing away of Kautilya. It is written by someone called Vishaka Datta, and it is written as a play which is meant to be performed on stage. Now, imagine if Vishaka Datta was an ancient day Ashwin Sanghi who was liberally taking fact and fiction and was mixing them together in order to make an interesting story. The point I'm making is that why am I bringing this up? Because today's historical element of Chanakya comes to us from the Mudra Rakshas. That is our point of reference. Whereas probably it wasn't written as a historical work. It was written as a Sanskrit play. So, I personally feel that what Napoleon said, that what is history but a fable that has been agreed upon? History is a fable that has been agreed upon. So there are multiple versions of the same event, multiple versions of the same person. There is Europe, which Europe and England will consider Winston Churchill to be the person who saved Europe and the UK from fascism. And then there are millions of Indians who will say that no, he was the butcher of Bengal. The events that happened in 1857 in India will be called the Great Revolt of 1857, but in the UK they are called the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Right. Same event, but completely different perspectives. Probably there could be a couple of hundred perspectives. So in that sense, how can we consider history to be a barometer of truth? Sorry, that question got me going. My apologies.
Amazing, Ashwin. I think you can hear the comments, and you can see the comments that everybody is fascinated and amazed by the wealth of knowledge that you have and the detail and the way you explain it and simplify it for everyone to capture and understand. I know it is nearly 6:30 and we are coming to the end of our time, though I would like to continue talking to you for hours, and hopefully before the end of the year, I'll probably pop into your house and hopefully get to chat with you and get more knowledge for myself as well. But I wanted to ask you...
Provided that we do it over a bottle of whiskey, Chetan. Otherwise, no. Spirit and spirituality has to go together.
Done. 100%. Ashwin, just the last, and I know there are a lot of questions coming in, but unfortunately, we may not have the time for you to address all of them. But a couple of books that, we can get to read, which may give us, for people who are interested, a little bit of a view on spirituality and on ancient wisdom.
Sure. I would say that probably a book which influenced my own rootedness, my own, for example, my grandfather used to tell me stories about pujas that he conducted on the banks of the Ganges in the middle of the night along with tantrics. Wow. And, he used to tell me about a sadhu who could levitate. And I used to really think that my Nanaji was probably consuming some form of weed or something or the other in order to make him imagine all of this. What I now realize is that just because I could not explain it doesn't mean that it wasn't real. In the sense that it's allowed me to open up my mind and understand that a lot of things are there within the realm of possibility. Right. So in that sense, a book which really enabled me to understand that was a book called An Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. Okay. And I've ended up reading that probably almost about 15 odd times during my life. And I would strongly recommend for everyone to definitely read that, because it's a book which makes you understand that this was a very interesting, I'm sorry, from time to time, I must make these little detours.
Please, we love them.
Interesting conversation that I ended up having with Dan Brown when he was here in Bombay. And we were several drinks down and he asked me, what is your definition of God? And I took on a piece of paper, I wrote down that G is equal to infinity minus K. And he asked me, what does this mean? And I said, G is whatever you decide to call God. Infinity is the entire Brahmand. Brahmand meaning Brahm and the egg of the universe. The entire universe is Brahmand. So infinity. And K is the extent of human knowledge. So whatever we don't know in the universe is what we attribute to God. The Egyptians saw the sun rise in the east and set in the west. They didn't know what it was, so they called it Ra, the sun god, who goes to sleep at night. But the moment we understood what the sun was, that it was a ball of fire, somehow the sun lost its divine status. So
Ashwin,
the point I'm making,
sorry to
sorry.
interrupt you, but we've got 8 seconds and Instagram's got to go off. So I want to really thank
Okay.
you. Hope to see you again on our platform. And thank you so much for enlightening us beyond